I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Wendy Keech. I'm the CEO of Health Translation SA. Many of you are hopefully familiar with what Health Translation SA, but I will give you a bit of a spiel in a couple of slides to introduce you to us and to what we're doing. But just to let you know that we are a partnership and we have 11 partners in our partnership, and we are a partnership. We're based at SAHMRI and we sit up on level 8, but we're absolutely something that's statewide and looking to really enhance the translation of research into practice in health services, not just SA Health, but right across the spectrum in both primary care, Aboriginal health, and across the acute sector. So we're really trying to mobilise things within the state. Before I launch into the presentation, I just want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the land, or I'm meeting on the land of the Kaurna people, and I'd hope that there's other people around the call that are meeting on either Kaurna land or other land that is owned by the traditional custodians. And I'd like to pay my respect to Kaurna people specifically, and acknowledge the cultural, spiritual, and physical and emotional connection with their land. We honour and pay our respects to Kaurna elders and anyone else who you may be joining from their land, both past and present, and all generations of Kaurna people now and into the future. And just acknowledge the important work that HTSA is pushing across and driving across the state, working with the Aboriginal community to make a difference in Aboriginal health outcomes. And it's a very important part of the work that we are doing here at HTSA, but working with the Aboriginal community and leaders from that area. So I'd now like to welcome you to the first of our HTSA Spotlight series. We love this new series and I love our new name. This one is on implementation science, and what we're doing is focusing the whole month of November to really think about progressing the implementation science agenda. Look, it's only a taster, so we're not saying we're going to solve the world or give you every bit of information you ever needed to know about implementation science. But what we can show you is putting a spotlight on the many things that are happening both within South Australia and nationally in this area. And I guess give you that taster so that you get what we're talking about. And then hopefully in 2022 and beyond, we can start to really build the skills, the capability, and the action in the implementation science field across the state so that we actually have things being implemented with some integrity. So welcome, and we really look forward to being able to take you on the journey with us. We're hoping that, not just hoping, we are going to make sure that what we are doing in the in these Spotlight series is something that is replicated in other areas. And hopefully next year we'll have some other Spotlight series focuses for a month. It could be on consumer engagement, it could be on other elements of research translation that we think are priorities and that we need to share. But the Implementation Science Month is focusing on webinars, training, videos, publications, anything else that is happening, and that there will be a steady stream of things that you can see on the program and hopefully use to your advantage and share with your friends, your colleagues, and importantly use to improve the work that you're doing in the state. So today's webinar is me giving you a little bit of info around terminology and I guess giving you a sense that this is an evolving space, and that you might not be perfectly in tune with all the language of implementation science is probably normal because it's evolving. And I think Gill and Liz will be able to introduce a few more of the details of implementation science, and I guess give you that sense of what it really is in action. Importantly, we are looking, as I said, around the training videos, publications and things in the area. And what you can do is, if you have questions, is put them in the chat function. So it is a webinar, so there is a chat function and you can actually ask questions. If we don't get them to all of them today, we will follow up after the session. So please feel free to use that as a mechanism to let us know what's on your mind. So let me just give you a tiny little intro to Health Translation SA. Probably there's lots of friends online, so I won't go into it in detail. And certainly we have a great website, so you can find a lot of good information on there. But as I said earlier, we are an NHMRC accredited Advanced Health Research Translation Centre. We have 11 committed and active partners. And the reason I say 11 committed and active is because just being part of the partnership is great and people sign on to an agreement and give us some money to help this happen, but we actually don't want tacit support. We actually want active support. So we really ask our partners to be part of the journey and part of the solution for South Australia. As I mentioned, we are statewide, so we encompass all of metropolitan Adelaide plus all of the regional of South Australia. We're a little different to some of the other translation centres across Australia, which are more regionally based. There is only one other that covers a whole state. We're about research, action and impact. So looking at research, how it can take action and how it can have impact. Our purpose is to accelerate research findings into healthcare practice and policy and increase whole of research translation capacity. So as you can see, what we're doing today is exactly fitting our purpose. The way we work is to work with our partners and other stakeholders as an independent catalyst and broker to mobilise collaborations to address major health system challenges. We're not about thinking of a good idea just for the sake of it. We're about looking at unmet need and really talking to consumers, whether the consumers are the health service, clinicians, or people who are actually health service consumers, so people who are patients and others and families and carers, to say what is the problems from your perspective and actually look at how we ensure the research that is being undertaken is actually addressing those very real needs. Down the bottom of the screen, you'll see our partners listed there. We've got the four universities, Flinders, Adelaide, UniSA and Torrens University. We have the Commission of Excellence Innovation on Health, and then we have all of SA Health, the two primary health networks, the Aboriginal Health Council, and the one logo that's missing there, but I think I can talk about it now. They are almost signed on, is SAHMRI. So they are also an active and a partner that we're really looking forward to having as an integral part of the way we work together. What we do is, as I mentioned, we're about research, action, impact, and we work with all the constituents. So we have health services, researchers, education people, policy people, consumers and community, and other stakeholders, including NGOs, funders, private hospitals and things, trying to drag everyone on the journey along that impact pathway from start right through to impactful solutions that can be scaled and sustained. We've been around for about 5 years. Look, I can't say that we're hand on heart that we're doing lots of scaled and sustained yet, but certainly we're moving projects along that continuum to really look at how they can be impactful, how they can make a difference to end users, to next users, to people that are needing to have research being taken seriously and to help the outcomes that they require. So we have a new strategic plan. We have 4 pillars of that strategic plan about bringing the right people together, about getting the right projects done, about building the right environment, and about celebrating and showcasing impact. Because often what we find is we're doing good work, but we aren't telling enough people about it. And so therefore the impact or the influence of those great projects and the learnings from them aren't always demonstrated. So these 4 pillars are very important to us now, and all the work we are doing over the next 3 to 5 years will be revolving around these activities. But also it's about working with health services, actually looking at health system change. It's not about research in universities or research in the academic realm. It's actually focusing on what the health services need. Hence, the implementation science is an important thing to make sure we're on that journey. Next slide, there we go. So what is why focus on research translation? Whoops, sorry, that's me. Why focus on research translation? It's a world, the world is questioning the value of research to consumers, consumers being all consumers, not just patients and individual consumers, but consumers as a collective, people who consume research as a collective. Billions of dollars are spent on health and medical research, and we know that not all of it is actually gets to the end of being introduced into practice. Some will argue that it takes up to 17 years for new discoveries to be put into clinical practice. And even then, only 14% of research is actually implemented. So you can see right there from those numbers that we've got an issue and we need to actually focus on this stuff. And that's why these research translation centres were established. We've also recognised there has been a disconnect between health services, researchers and end users, and that this needs to be unpacked and addressed, and that we want to change the landscape to ensure that research achieves real-world impact and improves the lives and health outcomes of people. There are a range of terminology that really represents this area. You can see on the screen now everything from knowledge translation, evidence-based practice, implementation science, research translation, translational research. There's all sorts of terms that are bandied around, and it's important to acknowledge that there are a range of things, and really these have evolved over time. And you can see from the start of this timeline that the terminology right from the 1990s, where research was research, and then it was about utilising research, and then it was about evidence-based medicine. And then you chuff along this road to 2010, and we start to hear terms like implementation science, knowledge mobilisation, knowledge translation, improvement science. And then you get right to the end where you're talking about complexity science. Now, it's not to say that any of these are more important or I guess, more influential, but just to say that it's evolving. And I've mentioned this a few times, but I think if you take out nothing else from this presentation of mine, is to say that all of these terms are okay. Just know that we have to put whatever we learn into practice, and we need to be working with the end users to make sure that the right messages and the right things are being tested in research. So knowledge translation can often be thought of as the umbrella term that goes across the top, that encompasses both the processes that we use to actually identify and develop the research agenda, and also the science, the implementation science on the right-hand side of this picture. So you can see we've got both the process, what to do, and then the science, how to do it. And so I think importantly, the terms that we have kind of fit under these areas of interest. And I'm sure Gill and Liz will talk a little bit more about this afterwards. So what is research translation? And this stuff comes right from the NHMRC website. Research translation is the process of translating the knowledge created by research into changes into practice and policy that improves individual and public health. So I think in a nutshell, it's all about taking things and making them, putting them into something that matters. So what is impact? And we talk a lot about impact, and the NHMRC is now talking a lot about impact. So impact is the effect of research after it has been adopted, adapted for use, or it's been used to inform future research. So what is the impact of what you're doing? Research impact also includes research that leads to a decision, that leads to a decision not to use things. So impact may be about taking on new things, but it also is about deciding to stop something. So I think we need to be really clear that impact and the effects of research can trigger a whole range of actions, and all of those are valid. Impact, we have impact around knowledge, we have impact around health, we have economic impact, and we have social impact. So the idea of making sure that whatever research is being done is impactful is critically important on the journey of exploring all of these terms and exploring implementation science. There are a whole lot of key features in research translation for impact, and they are outlined on this slide here. But I just wanted to highlight that partnerships, collaborations, learning to listen, learning to identify clearly the problem statement, engage the right people, building in evaluation, understanding that context matters, making sure there's a funded implementation strategy. All of these things on this slide are all elements of research translation that must be considered, but to recognise also that it's a dynamic and iterative process, and that we don't always know everything right at the start, and we have to be I guess, cognizant that we're on a journey and that that's okay. And we need to be able to unpick and learn as we go. So what is the ultimate problem we're trying to address? Always good to keep the eye on that ball and make sure that you've articulated a problem statement. So often we get a great idea and we just go gangbusters without going, what are we really trying to address here? What is the problem that we address? And then who is the people that are going to use this? Have we consulted with them? Have we asked them who, our next users or our end users? What do they think? And are they actually involved? So addressing, really understanding the problem we're trying to address, and then really making sure that the people that are affected by this problem are part of what you're doing are critical in this journey. So there are many terms, as I mentioned: knowledge translation, evidence implementation, implementation science, research translation, but really the message to take away is they're all about moving evidence into practice. So now we move on to the next part of today, and hopefully I haven't talked over my 15 minutes. I've done all right. Look, as I said, great to have you all here with us. I'm going to introduce Gill, Harvey and Liz Lynch. In fact, I'm going to get them to introduce themselves, but they are going to provide an update on implementation science and provide an overview of the science itself. And I think importantly for you guys, I just encourage you to grab with both hands the opportunities that this month offers to you to get your head around this subject. Some of the other translation centres are also working actively in this space, and I'd encourage you to hook into their conferences or in sessions or things on their websites, as well as things on our website, just to really embrace and get as much knowledge as you can around the rigour and the importance of thinking about how you implement and how you evaluate and how you make things stick, as opposed to just coming up with a good idea and getting a publication. So look, it's great to be working with you all. It's great to be really positioning this as part of solutions that need to be addressed in health services. And I'll move on to I hand over to Gill and Liz to get the next section going. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Everyone bear with me while I do the magic of the internet to just swap our slides across. So now Gill and Liz, you should be able to now take up screen sharing from your end, yep. And we'll hand over to you to continue the session.
You can talk and I'll get sorted. Thank you. Thanks, Annalise. And we'll do it as a double act, but I'm Gill, Harvey. Liz and I both work in the Caring Futures Institute in the College of Nursing and Health Sciences at Flinders. Been working together probably for the last 4 years or so in implementation. I've got a clinical background in nursing, and Liz is going to kick off, so I'll let her introduce herself.
Okay, so thanks for inviting us to present. Yeah, so my background, I was working as a hospital-based physiotherapist until 2012 when I did my PhD. So I've come into implementation science from probably quite a pragmatic background where I was implementing evidence as a clinician, and then I learned a lot more about how to do it better. Learned a lot of my mistakes all then made sense when I learned more about the theories of it. So what we'll be doing today is just providing an overview of what implementation science is. So today we'll be presenting about what is implementation science, presenting why do we need it. I think Wendy's done a pretty good job of doing a lot of this already. And then moving into some of the things about what we've learned. And certainly for me as a clinician coming into this space, I found lots of the jargon really overwhelming. So why would you apply a theory and a framework, and how to do that? And then some just directing you to some really helpful resources that we're aware of. So implementation science it's about being really scientific, really systematic, about using rigorous methods to promote uptake of research findings into routine practice. thereby improving the quality and effectiveness of health services. So this was a quote that's probably been quoted so much, but it was in the introduction to the journal Implementation Science, but it really did just set the scene for us all moving forward into implementing evidence in a really rigorous way. And you know, the definitions then start becoming a bit more nuanced as we don't know more about it, and really becoming a lot more cognizant of the fact that implementation science needs to look at the context. So you don't ignore or control for context, but you're actually starting to work with the context to make sure that clinical innovations are actually being used. So it's often when you're trying to implement something, you can't just pick something up from one setting and move it into another, but having to look at, you know, this is where it gets quite tricky, doing a rigorous way of it's about tailoring and working with the different people, working with the different innovations in the different workplaces, but doing that in a systematic way. So we'll be working through this as we go. So as Wendy's pointed out, there's lots of related ideas, lots of related terms, lots you know, jargon really. But we'll be trying to consistently use implementation science, which I won't go into too much about why you use different words, but when we're defining implementation science, it's using non-scientific language can be helpful. So in terms of the intervention or practice or innovation, this is the thing that is based on evidence that we want people to do. So in implementation science, the thing is something that has been proven through research to be effective with a particular cohort of probably patients is the way I think about it. Effectiveness research looks at whether this thing that's evidence-based works. Implementation research looks at how we can help people and places do the thing and do it consistently. Implementation strategies are what we do to help people and places do the thing. And then implementation outcomes are how much and how well do they do the thing. So there's lots of different facets when you're looking at implementation science. Is effectiveness, does it work? How do we help people do it? And when they do it, are they doing it as well as we want them to be doing it? And
yeah, thanks, Liz. And Wendy's done a good job of setting the scene, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but as she said, there's a huge time lag often in terms of innovations finding their way into routine practice, that there's a well-known gap between research evidence and its application, and that contributes to the avoidable research waste, which Wendy said, you know, roughly around 15–16% of research ever gets to that final endpoint. And that's why there's been growing recognition that we need to accelerate the speed of translation, and COVID has shown that we can do that, and improve the effectiveness of how we go about implementation. And just a bit of historical context to some of that. So the awareness around the gaps between research evidence and practice were first talked about at the end of the 90s in a significant way. In the US, they had a roundtable, and that came to the conclusion that on average, appropriate care, so care that was in line with evidence-based clinical recommendations, was delivered about 60% of the time. So that was the late 90s. Then we jumped to the current time, and in Australia, Geoffrey Braithwaite, Bill Runciman and colleagues have run a series of these studies called CareTrack. So the first CareTrack study was published in 2012, looking at the appropriateness of care delivered to adults in Australia. And you can see the text in the red circle. That came to a conclusion that on average it was delivered 57% of the time. And more recently, the CareTrack Children's study and that came to the conclusion that, again, an overall estimate adherence to quality of care indicators was just under 60% of the time. And now the same team are leading research around care track aged care. But I think the message is that we've been aware of these gaps between evidence and practice for some 20 years now, but we still seem to come to conclusions that what actually gets implemented into routine practice is around 60%. So despite this proliferation of evidence that we can use to inform practice, we've not cracked how to get better at implementing that evidence into practice. And that's really where we would see implementation science coming into the equation, is giving us direction around why that gap exists, but more importantly, what can we actually do about it? So I thought it might be useful to just talk a little bit around what have we learned so far. I've been working in this field for the last 15 to 20 years. So, you know, we've not closed the gaps between evidence and practice by the looks of things, but what have we learned so far? So the first thing I would say is that we've exploded the myth of the pipeline. That, you know, when I first started thinking about translation and implementation, there were all these neat diagrams of how it was supposed to work. And it was very much a linear and a rational process that took us through from discovery research through to improved health. And we've seen variations on that, where people talk about the translational gaps, and it started off as two, T1 and T2, and they've got increasingly sophisticated over time. But I think they don't represent the reality of implementation, and thinking in terms of rational linear pipelines is not helpful in terms when you think about the real world of implementation. And anyone who has tried to get something new introduced into policy or practice, I think would concur with the fact that it can be incredibly complex. It's one step forward, two steps back. There are lots of components that come into play. It's not just about having strong research evidence. Evidence doesn't implement itself. As we've heard so far, it depends on the context, it's unpredictable, and I think really importantly, it does not follow the biomedical model. It's a social process as much as a technical process, and is highly dependent on relationships and on collaboration and networks. And in terms of the implications of that, it's really that we do need to think differently, that we may have been trained to think rationally, but when we think about implementation, that it is acknowledging that more dynamic and iterative processes that are involved, that we need to think about the social and the behavioural aspects of implementation. And that means being flexible, not trying to find a one-size-fits-all approach, but knowing how to respond appropriately to different contextual situations, and think about what that means in terms of strategies, roles and processes that can enable implementation. And we'll talk about those a little bit more as we go through.
So there's a whole new world of implementation theories, models and frameworks. So there's a stack of them. So there's quite commonly used in Australia is the theoretical domains framework. There's the REAIM framework. So we've just collated some of the ones that we're most commonly used that you might have come across. The normalisation process theory, the Paris or IPARIS framework, which Gill was heavily involved with a while, has been involved in developing. The consolidated framework for implementation research, knowledge to action is probably probably the most famous and most widely used approach. And then we've got handbooks, we've got journals, we've got a stack of things. So, where do you start and why would you use one? So it's important to be really, part of the approach of being really systematic is to build on what we've learned before, and that's where these theories, models and frameworks can come into play. While they each have different focuses and different nuances, which we won't go into now, each one can provide a scaffold for planning, doing and or evaluating implementation. One thing that's really important is when you're starting out an implementation project is to start having a look at some of these theoretical approaches and choosing one that you think might fit your project well, and using that to plan your project. So quite often people use them at the end of the project, but it's really important to use this to plan your project, because you can, depending on your level of experience, you can really avoid some rookie mistakes by using some of these approaches, because they do guide you through the sorts of things to look at and plan and measure. Despite which approach you use, there are some really common elements. So almost always, in fact, every single time, you need to be really mindful of what it is. What is the thing that you're wanting to change? What is the evidence-based practice or the intervention or the innovation that you're wanting people to do? Then looking at who are the players, who are the stakeholders, or so who are these people that you want to implement it and who needs to support it? Who are the people that might be really anti it, and making sure that you've factored that into your planning. And then where are you intending to implement it? So you might be looking at, it might be in a GP clinic, or it might be in a ward of a hospital, but then you also can look at the broader picture of what's going on in the whole statement of health at that point in time. And then the how. So how, what are you going to do to implement it? What are your strategies going to be? And we'll break these down a little bit more. So first of all, the what. What is it that you're wanting people to do? So when you have, we call it an evidence-based practice, what is the underlying evidence? So what is the research? So what is, has there been effectiveness trials that show that delivering this strategy or this treatment will lead to a better clinical outcome? And how strong is that evidence? Do you know that it only works with a particular cohort? Do you know that it works with everybody? And then what are the clinical experiences? So if you're asking clinicians to change their behaviour, are they going to enjoy doing this? Are they going to find that it makes their job easier? Or in fact, does it make it really hard? Or does it disempower them? Or does it give them a whole, particularly if you're asking someone to stop something, that can be a bit of a barrier. Or if it gives the clinicians a bad feeling by doing this particular intervention. And then what is the patient or consumer experience? And then, so do they like receiving this treatment? Can they see immediate benefits is also something that can play into that. And then what is the local evidence or data? So often if for instance, typically if a research trial has been done in a particular setting, that setting will uptake and use it really well. Other settings might be a bit slower to come on board. So if it's been locally generated, that can be a real boon as well. Then when you look at those sources of evidence, are they aligned or in conflict? So for instance, some examples might be that there's really strong evidence that warfarin can reduce your risk of blood clots. But then patients don't always like taking warfarin because that means they have to get extra blood tests and makes them feel yuck. Or there's good evidence that having compression bandages for pressure ulcers on legs helps the legs heal better. But patients don't particularly like wearing compression bandages sometimes, because particularly if it's hot or it feels uncomfortable. And does that mean then that the patient loses out because they don't get their daily dressings done with the district nurses? So in fact, that makes them really lonely. So these sorts of things where the evidence there for clinical outcome might not measure up with people's enjoyment of delivering or receiving that care. versus one thing that in the stroke world has taken off very quickly, has been implemented very quickly, was thrombolysis, or the clot busting drug, and clot retrieval, where they go in and take out a clot for people with really big strokes. So with this, a person comes in with quite a heavy, devastating stroke, receives the treatment, and can go from being unable to move, unable to talk, to directly after the surgery looking as good as new sometimes. So there's a really, really obvious benefit. The patients obviously love not being really disabled. The clinicians feel really proud of being able to contribute to someone's life. Very tricky, you know, it's really tricky systematically to get that done, but the evidence is really well aligned to supporting delivery of that intervention. Then looking at, does the proposed intervention offer an advantage over current practice? So that takes into consideration all those things. Often, sometimes things take more time, you know, so that then you have to start thinking about, well, then do you need to remove something in order to deliver the thing that you're wanting them to do? Can you adapt to local context? And then how difficult is it to implement this thing? Are you simply asking someone to take a single tablet that they have full control over, or are there multiple players that all need to work together, and you need expensive equipment to deliver your intervention? You know, so that level of complexity of the actual intervention is also important to consider. Looking at who is doing the implementing, and being really specific about taking the time to track all the different players, and what will influence their response to what you're asking people to do. So there are things about that can give people that intrinsic motivation, so the things that make them want to do something, so their motivation, what are their values and beliefs? Do they think they're actually doing this already? So pretty, you know, in terms of hand washing, people think I'm doing that already, but then when you actually go into audit, sometimes people aren't doing it as well as they think. How important do they see this? And do their colleagues and people they respect, are they promoting it as well? And then you have the things that are more about, can people do it? Do they have the skills? Do they have the knowledge? Do they have the time and resources? What's going on in their environment in terms of helping them, support them to learn and change? Are the leadership on board? So all these things about enabling them to create change in their workplace. Do they have the power and authority to change things, or is actually they've got no power and they're still being asked to do business as usual because it's just about getting through the day? Then looking at the place in which you're implementing something. So this is where we'd be talking, you know, often in this sort of, we're talking about context. And so looking at what's going on in, what factors are, characteristics of the context. So Laura Dan Schroeder talks about the set of circumstances or unique factors that surround a particular implementation effort. And so we talk about the inner context. So that would be the local situation. So if you're talking in it, that might be a GP clinic, or it might be a ward of a hospital. So the immediate point of implementation. So what's going on there in terms of culture, in terms of leadership, and in terms of readiness to change. And then the wider organisational level. So that might be the network of GP practices, or it might be a hospital level thing. And again, you're still talking about culture, priorities to change, how much support is there within that organisation to support the change, how receptive is the place, and learning orientation. And then again, looking at the wider health system and policy level, you know. And so one example that we've got here in terms of, I guess it takes into context, is things like with COVID and how rapidly things have shifted because of what's been going on in that wider health system, in terms of like telehealth is all of a sudden funded when we could never get it funded before through national directives. And then how are you going to implement? So this is looking at what sort of strategies will you use? So it's really important not to jump in. I think probably one of the rookie mistakes people do is they jump in with what they're going to do before they've actually taken the time to think about why they're going to do what they're going to do. So it's really important to have thought about the what, the who, the where, to then look at, to be able to have a really good understanding of the barriers and enablers, to getting you having this thing done in practice. And then once you've considered all those barriers and enablers, then think about what your appropriate implementation strategies are. And consider whether dedicated implementation support roles are needed. And I think the more and more I've worked in this space, it does seem that the more support and the more time you give a project, the more chance you have of success. Things are never as straightforward as what you initially think they are. I think I'm handing over to you now, Jill.
Yeah. And you know, there are a lot of implementation strategies that can be used. This is just a list of some of the most common ones, and many of them have been evaluated. So one of the Cochrane review groups on effective practice and organisation of care, or EPOC, has got reviews published on many of these. The top of the list, audit and feedback, is probably one of the most consistently effective, but that's a useful source to look at, and they're typically things that you would think of, but just as Liz said, you know, there is a tendency with implementation that everyone jumps to training, you know, we'll put in training, but it's really around understanding where the needs are and then choosing what to put together. But in many ways, you know, when you look at the strategies, you've almost got a list of ingredients. And for me, I think the holy grail of effective implementation is knowing how do you combine those strategies, you know, interactive education, using opinion leaders, implementing audit and feedback. How do you know what combination to put together so that the end result looks like this rather than like this? And that's where the real art of implementation comes in. And you can do it, you can get better at it if you understand where you're starting from and really think around what are the barriers, what are the enablers, and how do we leverage those to get the right strategies in the right situation. And so the how is very much the active ingredient, and where the science comes in terms of putting things together. So before we finish for any questions, I thought it would be useful just to give a couple of brief examples. And these are both from projects that I'm currently involved in, which are implementation research studies being undertaken with colleagues at QUT and other universities, particularly in Queensland. And the first one, called the Interact study, is looking at trying to reduce non-beneficial treatment when people are at end of life and in hospital. So it's about trying to introduce interventions that would improve appropriate care and treatment. And as Liz said, you know, we start with the problem. So in this case, the problem was that we know that hospitalisation rates of older people are increasing. We know that end of life care is increasingly medicalised, and estimates suggest that probably around a third of people receive treatment at end of life that is not actually beneficial to them. So this study is very much trying to address that evidence practice gap. And we have used, in this case, a framework called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research to frame the whole study. So we've designed it with that in mind. We've done the baseline assessment using it, and we collect data throughout the study that gives information around that framework. So it's very much focusing on how do, in our case, how do the clinical teams feel about non-beneficial care and receiving information about patients on their caseload who are receiving non-beneficial care? How do what is their relationship with the family and with the individuals themselves? What are the contextual factors? And then that's determining some of the strategies that are being used. And the implementation strategy in this particular case is screening screening patients who come into the hospital who are aged 75 years and older using established tools, and then flagging that information to the clinical teams who have flexibility to agree what their clinical response will be. And the study, which is a step-wedge trial, is concurrently collecting both outcome data, so is that non-beneficial treatment reducing, but also process data around, is our implementation strategy working effectively and as we intended it to. And then the second example is also in the care of older people, but in this case it's older people who are living in residential aged care facilities, and there's good evidence that they are experiencing frequent emergency transfers to hospital when their condition deteriorates, but that's not necessarily the best thing from their point of view because of the risks associated with it and the stress that it can cause for the patient and their family, and it's also increasingly costly for the health system. And again, we've got evidence that up to a third of hospital transfers from residential aged care facilities could be prevented with the right systems in place, and as you can see, it's a costly thing to do. So this case, the solution has been to skill up the staff within the facilities to get better at identifying and managing clinical deterioration, but it is a multifaceted intervention. So they do get additional education, they get decision support tools, they've got new diagnostic equipment like bladder scanners with training to learn how to use them, and importantly a clinical facilitator who works with them. So because facilitation is a core construct within the IPARIS framework, that's the one that we've used in this study. And I've undertaken a couple of pilot studies beforehand to get proof of concept. So this is very much an implementation study, but as you'll see, there's embedded process evaluation so that we see how the implementation is playing out over time as the study progresses. They were a bit of a gallop through, but it's really to just try and give you a sense of what an implementation study looks like. It's not rocket science, but it is being systematic around doing an initial baseline assessment of likely barriers and enablers, and then designing strategies that meet them and collecting evaluation data that gives you insights into both the implementation processes and the outcomes.
Do you want to keep talking?
And just really beginning to sort of pull things together. You know, what does this mean at a practical level of implementation? I think, as we said at the beginning, it is about pragmatically using these theories and frameworks to help plan and conduct evaluation studies, and ideally using them throughout the whole process so that you get a sense of, you know, if you're going into 10 different settings, where are the really hard ones going to be, and where do you put your effort, and where do you put together the right combination of implementation strategies, and what data will you collect so that you can see how things are progressing over time.
So just quickly wrap this up. So just the key messages is take your time. So don't rush. Don't assume that people are rational. So go in expecting complexity. Go in and assess the situation and plan for the real situation, not for the ideal situation. So assess the barriers and enablers, and then develop your strategies as much as you can. Pay attention to both, not just the technical, but also the social processes, and be prepared to flex and change depending on what you find as you're going along. And then think about how you can embed the changes. For further information, there are now specialist journals. Probably the most academic one is Implementation Science, and then there's other ones around as well, and quite a few books to help us around. So just whizzing through that, and there's websites as well.
Yeah, and we can share information through Annalise around some of this, but you can see as Health Translation SA, I've got the Spotlight series. Several of the other health translation centres are running their own initiatives and have got useful resources. So there are resources out there, not just in Australia, many of the other centres across the world as well.
Wrapping up in case there's questions.
Yeah, so should we stop?
Yeah, I'm trying.
Thank you so much, Gill and Liz, for that presentation. I think that's some really interesting things, and we had some chuckles here with the fallen apart cake with the great ingredients. I think was my personal favourite side, but a lot of great insights, I think, in, as you say, how to be pragmatic and applying some of these technical theories and frameworks into real world situations so we can actually get the work done. So I really appreciate your knowledge there, and those links to the other resources as well, where people can find some more info. We did have a couple of questions come through on the chat, so I'll just pose those to you, and I'll let you speak to the group to them. So the first one is around that research findings are traditionally published as peer-reviewed publications. And our questioner is wondering, do you think researchers can further dissemination by pushing towards guideline development for implementation? And if there's research findings that have a clear advantage of the intervention, is that push to guideline development going to help? Any thoughts?
I should disclose that I'm on the guideline committee for stroke, so I'm all for guidelines. I love guidelines. It does. I think the more people are involved in guideline development, of people that are, it's like you should have people who are affected by the change. You should have people that are creating the knowledge. You should have people that are implementing the knowledge. Everybody should be involved in guideline development, I think. There's normally very rigorous processes to being involved in guideline development, so I do think researchers should be involved as much as they can, but also just check with your clinical area on what the rules are for how they do their guidelines.
But I think there's still potentially the same issues with guidelines. I know they may be accessed differently, but you've still got to make the information within them accessible. So, many clinical guidelines there's quite a lot of information in them. So it's also, I think, as well as the peer-reviewed publications, the synthesis into guidelines, is what are the right media then to use to get the information out. So it may be videos, it may be infographics, really thinking about who the audience is and what's the best way to get the message to that particular group. So for researchers, I just think that we've got to be really thinking. Wendy started off and said, think end user. Who do you want to actually apply this information, and find the way of connecting with them that is the most relevant.
Yeah, I might just to add another comment as well, Gill, just building on that, is that publication, academic publication, obviously really important for researchers' credentialing and all of that stuff, but that's not an impact in itself. It really is taking that next step to say, but taking the next step at the start instead of at the end, to say, how is this going to be used more broadly? And certainly guidelines are a step, but we actually want policy change, and we actually want system change, and we actually want models of care that reflect the evidence. So that's the end game. The end game is guidelines are good, but guidelines can sit on the shelf as well. So I'm with you, both of your answers I completely agree with, but it really is for everybody to be thinking, the end game.
Thank you. All right, we've got, there's a couple more questions. We'll hopefully be able to fit both of them in our 2 minutes to go. So we have another question saying that models you've spoken to seem predominantly focused on helping clinicians make and implement better clinical decisions, but wondering, can they also be used to help consumers learn how to make better lifestyle choices? For example, knowing what would constitute healthy choices and following through on doing that. So speaking of
probably the theoretical domains framework is perfect for consumers. So I think that was developed, it's set on behaviour change. So I think they give lots of examples about ceasing smoking and that sort of stuff. So for consumers making healthy choices, I'd have a look at the theoretical domains framework and see if that felt good for purpose.
And another one that I think is a very interesting, possibly philosophical question. So in grant funding processes at present, do research projects need to have an implementation plan? And if not, why not?
So that is a good question. So one example would be, if you look at the criteria for NHMRC partnership grants, and you know how they have to score 7, these are the criteria you need to meet, etc., etc. Then to get high scoring requirements are that there is application of an implementation theory, or that it's informed by implementation theory. So I think things are changing, you know. MRFF is very much around the translational, so I would say it strengthens your case and your application if you show very clearly that you're framing it with knowledge of implementation and planning for implementation from the get-go.
Yeah, I was going to agree with that, Gill, just to say that the MRFF is all about this. And if you don't actually demonstrate that you've got people involved from health services or end users or industry who are there at the table, who are already thinking about what they're going to do with this, you will not get funded. That is the model that's emerging. And I think unless we get ahead of the game, we will not be as successful as we could be.
Thank you. I'm just going to very quickly share my screen again. We'll do a little bit of a wrap up. So let's see, changing slides, all the magic. If it's, oh no, hang on, I'll stop that. Sorry, I thought I was being clever, but I'm not. There we go. Get that one happening. So click all the right buttons. Click share. We go. So I'd like to thank again Gill and Liz for that presentation, and for the attendees with your questions there, some really interesting points. And just to very quickly wrap up, just to highlight our webinar series that we've got on for the rest of the month. So next Thursday, we've got Craig Lockwood and Natasha Howard giving us a session on perspectives in different contexts for implementation science. And then November 15th, Tana Petman, Akushla Lyndale and Peter Hubert will be speaking to applying implementation science in policy context and in clinical practice contexts, and then followed up at the end of the month from Alison Kitson and Saravana Kumar, really looking about using implementation to improve care in health services. So some really excellent further sessions that we've got going on, as well as a whole swathe of additional resources that will be coming out via the Health Translation SA Twitter, but also we can send them out via email. So if you'd like to get that stuff straight to your inbox, email us at inquiries@healthtranslationsa.org.au, and then we can send all the links, which will include things like the journals and some of those websites that Gill and Liz spoke to. Anything else, Wendy, that you'd like to?
And so just to wrap up then, and to say thank you so much. And I want to just acknowledge and thank Annalise for all her hard work in pulling this series together in a very short period of time. Well done. And look, we really encourage people to take advantage of the opportunity that this month presents to hear from people like Gill, Liz, Natasha, Saravana, Alison, Peter Hibbert. You know, these are people that have thought about this stuff a lot for a lot of years. So it's a great opportunity for you also. Please take it up. And also that moving into 2022, we will be setting up a community of practice around implementation science, and certainly you'll be able to get involved and just have an ongoing trickle of information that you can all be part of. So thank you for your time, and thanks very much for everyone who's participated in terms of presenters, and also to Annalise for organising it, and from the others in my staff team at HTSA who put up with us when we're doing all these busy things. So thanks everybody, and really glad you've all been part of it. So hopefully see you at the next one. Farewell.